A civil war has erupted in Syria. No, it's not 2009 all over again, but why are we seeing renewed clashes against the new Syrian government despite international recognition? Plus, why is this specific civil war light backed by foreign powers? Just what is going on and what do you need to know? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. I'll give you a primer so that we don't have to sound quite so ignorant at parties. Okay, what is the overall situation? Well, you might recall that a couple months ago, the Assad regime was booted out of Syria by a rebel group, partially, or at least the core of which was made up of HTS, one of the numerous Sunni terror groups. But this Sunni terror group got international backing when they promised to go legit, and they were able to essentially push out many of the other anti-government forces, as well as the Assad regime, occupying the regions shown in green. This region in blue is actually a semi-free Kurdish state. This gray region here represents a sort of Turkish demilitarized zone. The Turks said, listen, we don't like the PKK, so we are going to occupy this strip here as our own personal DMZ. But the majority of Syria, as well as crucially Damascus itself, the largest and core city, is under control of an internationally recognized government for the first time in a long time. And this is and the majority of the state, again, is in agreement about who is in charge. Well, they were. You might notice that despite me saying just now that the Syrian government basically has everyone in agreement who's in charge, there's a bunch of, things happening here. Why? What are the problems? What's going on? Yeah, you can see literally a whole big dynamic map here. Well, there's a couple of issues. The first of which, this was probably caused by a decision by Israel. But after the new regime took over, one of the things that we pointed out even on this channel is that the person in charge of the regime, who is, again, it's internationally recognized and promises to be secular. The problem is, you might recall, the Taliban also promised to be a secular regime, respect minorities, women's rights, and bring Afghanistan into a modern era. But within about 6 months of taking over, almost none of those things proved to be true. The Taliban remained Islamic fundamentalist to the core, and they basically introduced exactly the old regime all over again. No music, no girls getting educated, no religious minorities, and a strict interpretation of Islam enforced by, the sword. So one of the fears, and again, I think is justified, is that when you have someone heading this new government, this new peaceful, inclusive government, who served as a militant in Iraq, including killing U.S. troops in the country and spending time in a U.S. prison, this is not somebody who I would trust to cooperate and coordinate with the West. Particularly, Israel says, this is not somebody we want on our border. In fact, when he was fighting as a militant, he adopted the name al-Jilani, which is of course a reference to the Golan Heights, a Syrian region occupied by Israel, and has been since like 1967. And so when somebody takes over your neighboring country, says, oh yeah, no, in my 20s, I literally was a kill the West militant and actually did kill Westerners. Now I'm occupying your country. Oh, by the way, yeah, back then my name was, Free Golan Heights. But no, don't worry. I'm going to respect your territorial claims. Israel has said, not going to work for us. So what they've instituted is a policy that says, listen, you can control your country, but you cannot deploy military forces anywhere in the southern part of the country. No deployment of your military. And they said, we will make this happen by force, right? Now, this is a sort of fraught problem for a bunch of reasons. You can see here that the IDF actually has advanced along the ground, occupying this strip of land here, basically expanding their own demilitarized zone, a sort of classic conundrum where, again, the Israelis occupy the Golan Heights. Then there's a bunch of Israeli settlers that show up. Now they go, okay, well, you're in our buffer zone now. Now we need a buffer zone for the buffer zone, right? And so they end up with this ground forces creating their own buffer zone, but then their Air Force is enforcing a much wider swath of demilitarization, right? Israeli government forces are prohibited, or excuse me, Syrian government forces prohibited from operating. But here's the problem. What happens when you have an area that's been in basically complete anarchy for 15 years and you finally have police forces or a central authority that can project power with guns, with an army? Well, what happens when you gut that army? The answer isn't that people simply agree to hold hands by being nice. The answer is they start to kill each other, right? And so basically, the best way to think of this is a persistence of the previous status, right? So as we talk about, here's a nice Wikipedia summary that starts in April 2025 of a minority group called the Syrian Druze. Now, the Druze are a religious minority. They are not Muslim. They are not a Muslim sect. They are considered as a separate Abrahamic religion. And crucially, the Druze are considered they are a religious minority in Israel. And unlike the Palestinians, they are welcome to be full citizens of Israel. Many Druze actually serve in the Israeli military, and many Druze even occupy senior officer ranks of the Israeli military. So, despite being a relatively small number, there is a pretty robust, let's see if we can find the map here. There's a pretty robust population of Druze in Israel. Let's see if we can get this here. So what that means, though, is that, here we go. Here's a decent map. Okay. Here is areas where the Druze live. So you can see here is sort of Druze territory in Syria. Here's Druze territory within the Golan Heights and sort of extending into Syria. You can see there also exist in and around Lebanon, in the central Lebanon. Remember, Hezbollah is effectively the government of southern Lebanon. They also are in the Israeli town of Galilee and Carmel. So as well as, I'm not sure, this may indicate that they also are in kind of the Golan Heights in the south. But the point is, you can see that they are a robust community within Israel. And some of them, again, say, listen, we're not Israeli. We don't want Israeli citizenship. But again, you can point to Druze advancing far into the Israeli military hierarchy. So they are considered kind of an acceptable or good minority within Israel. What's also interesting is that Druze religion allows no conversion and no leaving. There is no process for leaving the religion. You're always going to be Druze, and you cannot join the Druze. You have to be born into it. So it's a religious minority, but also an ethnic one as well. And so they, as you might know, are really have always tried to be and been on some level semi-autonomous within Syria, but this has kind of, they're only 3% of Syrians. So they have a sort of minimum necessary relationship to the government, right? And so there's been a bunch of problems here. One is that the Druze have said, listen, the Druze have shared the same concerns the Israelis have, where they've said, listen, you, the new Syrian government, you say you're going to include minorities, but you're literally a militant Islamist. You literally fought as part of the international jihad in the early 2000s in Iraq. We don't trust you to protect us. And so there are some rumors, right? So in some cases, the Druze seem to have sort of centralized their control over the community, right? So Druze are essentially having their own militia, and increasingly saying, listen, we want to have, we don't want to have Syrian government forces patrolling Druze territory. We'd rather have Druze security forces patrolling our own territory. There are also, start to be rumors that some members of the Druze population actually asked to be under Israeli rule, given that the Israelis have a long history of not killing them. They say, well, we don't have a dog in this fight, right? We're neither Muslim nor Jewish, but we really like the fact that the Israelis don't massacre us on a routine basis. But the individual who's seen as the head honcho, the head religious and political leader of the Syrian Druze, actually said, no, we don't support the Israeli intervention into Syria. We don't support this kind of demilitarized zone or the demilitarized zone. He says, listen, I want to be a part of Syria's social and territorial unity. But then Druze sheiks go to Syria to visit to Israel to visit a historic Druze prophet shrine. So a lot of the Muslim communities go, no. I think these Druze are agents of Israel, right? Well, then in April and May, you start to see increasing sort of localized violent clashes between the Druze communities and the Syrian government forces, right? And all right, Druze representative, of course, want some level of protected autonomy from the central government. And you start to see in late February, March, and April, increasingly clashes between Druze militias and the General Security Service of the state of Syria. In March 2025, the president of Syria, who's now calling himself Ahmed Hussein al-Shara, signed an agreement with the Druze representatives from that province where the Druze are concentrated, saying saying that basically you guys are going to be integrated in state institutions and giving you certain autonomy concessions, right, including locally recruited Druze police forces, recognizing their distinct cultural identity. But then, of course, it erupts into conflict because there's increasingly militia, and this is actually fascinating. This is probably the first I've heard of this. A conflict had stemmed from the circulation of a fabricated audio, possibly AI generated, that sounded like the Druze religious leader Marwan Kirwan saying to containing derogatory statements about the Prophet Muhammad. And to the Muslims of Syria, they said, listen, you are exactly who you always said you were, or rather, you are who we always thought you were, which is to say anti-Muslim, sort of an Israeli proxy. And there was a bunch of Syrian militia sort of starting to target the Druze. And the takeaway is this goes back and forth and increasingly starts to look like the government forces are actually the ones doing the targeting, right? So it went from sort of militia that are aligned with the government to the government itself, right? Targeting Druze villages. Well, obviously the Druze are like, we have to defend ourselves from this massacre. And they also claim that Syrian security forces were actually preventing the Druze from reinforcing, sending militia to reinforce their towns. And the military council of the Druze is unable to assist their members. So then what happens? Well, the Israelis say, listen, right now we have two things in southern Syria that we like. One, we have this demilitarized zone. But if the Syrian government keeps sending their forces into this zone, well, it's violating the agreement, or rather, calling it an agreement is pretty generous. It's violating the thing that we told them to do. We basically instructed them, said, don't put your forces in here. The problem, of course, is that the people that the government forces are targeting are also seen as, if not pro-Israel, as they're seen at least as a country, as a minority group with deep ties to the Israeli government, and one of the few forces in the Middle East that is on Israel's borders that is not actively hostile to Israel. So they say, listen, we're going to protect these Druze. And so they bomb not just targets within the Druze community, right? Militia convoys and the like, but also they bomb many of the Syrian military headquarters in Damascus as a kind of signal to the Syrian government to say, listen, don't massacre the Druze, don't continue to harass them, but also don't violate our the demilitarized zone that we've mandated. But that also caused a problem because, right, this supposedly quickly reached a kind of agreement between the Syrian government and basically the Muslim majority and the Druze. But then things got even worse because in the absence of any kind of power, for lack of a better term, well, you have, for example, the Bedouins. Bedouins, of course, are a Muslim minority who are kind of their own. They're a nomadic people that also sort of roam the desert, right? So they literally don't have towns. They're Bedouins, they're nomads, but they still have their own militia, and they at least have numbers on their sides. And so the Bedouins begin to attack the Druze. And, right, you can see a truce agreement was announced on Wednesday between Syria and the Druze factions. Government forces withdrew from the province, and almost immediately, the Bedouins, called for the assistance of other Syrian tribes, meaning that a bunch of militia flooded the area, and now the Bedouins are fighting the Druze again. So, that the Israelis have now said, listen, because this is crazy, because we forced the Syrian security forces out of southern Syria, now Israel says, actually, we want them to go back in and put these tribes in their place and stop this. This is absolutely preposterous, right? But this is confusing and it's weird and it's absolutely completely typical for the Syrian civil war. This is what, if you're like, this is complicated, this is weird, this is what the Syrian civil war has been like for over 15 years. And, we're going to talk a little bit about what this bodes for the future of this Syrian government. But before we talk about kind of this and the implications, I wanted to mention, of course, that get your strike gum, guys. I've got a 1-month-old at home and a 2-year-old, and you get run ragged. Kids are hard. Who knew? But that's okay. I still managed to work out. I'm still training up for a triathlon, possibly in as little as 3 months. But the reason I can do it is, of course, because I have basically an infinite supply of strike gum. What is it? 0 sugar, an energy drink's worth of caffeine, goes where you go, fits in your pocket, your glove box, your gym bag. You chew it on the go. You get your energy, right? Guys like me, if you're one of those guys who doesn't let being tired or busy stop them, strike gum is where it's at. And there's a reason. 80% of strike gum orders last month were repeat customers, right? So that tells you that when you buy one piece of strike gum, literally at this point, it's like 4 and 5 people are saying, hey, give me more of it. It's a no-brainer. So go to strikegum.com. We also have a 10% discount promo code you get just for signing up, just for being a new customer. So you absolutely should get it. Okay, what is the implication of all this? What does all this mean for the Middle East and more importantly, for the global security? Well, the problem is that, one, Israel is continuing its sort of willingness to intervene in all of these other countries. And it's almost become like a parody. Because remember, the Israel-Palestine still going on, still active combat in Gaza. You can see here large portions of the Gaza Strip continuing to have significant Israeli military activity. Of course, you have some level of more like policing actions in the West Bank. You also have increasing some level of continued actions by the Israelis targeting, doing targeted actions in Lebanon. But now you also have the Israelis pushing out from the Golan Heights, expanding even more. And I think what you have is the fact that the Israelis have not so much a domestic problem, but I think their government does somewhat rely on this state of constant war to prevent criticism of the government, because there is significant criticisms within Israel of Netanyahu's government. But also, it's becoming, every time they take these sort of actions, it becomes harder and harder to justify what they're doing. And the fact that they took this kind of military action in southern Syria, when they, especially given that they asked for the Syrian government to return after having bombed the Syrian government, you can kind of see why they're probably pretty pissed. And the other thing that's really hard is this is a brand spanking new government that's still clearly getting its feet under it. And instead of the Israelis working with the government to give them at least a chance to do the right thing, and to exhibit sort of strength in the face of increasingly what looks like militia that are still ready and willing to fight, they're intervening, attacking the government, then withdrawing, asking the government to return. This sort of like security first, or like this perception of security as being a function exclusively of territory you hold and militia you drive away, is, I think, a really simplistic kind of security thinking. Because here's the thing, right? Look, the Israelis also have this Sinai that's kind of functions as a demilitarized zone, right? There's actually a UN monitoring mission here between Egypt and Israel. There was a lot of fighting in the Sinai, again, in the late 70s. But you can see that places, for example, you know who doesn't have this problem, the Israelis don't have this problem with, is Jordan. And the reason is not because they have ordered a Jordanian, military DMZ. It's because they have a political agreement, a political détente with the Jordanian government, right? And so Jordan's a pretty staunch U.S. ally. Israel's a staunch U.S. ally. They have enough aligned security interests that they are willingly tolerate each other. And so, in fact, what might have been a better strategy, especially because everybody wants a stable Syrian government where they can work with one person, where they can pick up the phone and call one guy and get something done in Syria. The whole international community wants this. So the fact that Israel is out here weakening the government and then asking the government to return is like bad, confusing policy. It doesn't really make a ton of sense. And the problem is, by this whiplash, remember, they destroyed the Syrian army headquarters. Well, this is destroying the military headquarters of a government that has only a loose control of its military forces. You don't really want to create more instability. So you would almost have Israel better off as having these Syrians, the Syrian government, assert greater control over their militia. You would want to help them centralize power. Again, if the reason they have a relative détente with the Jordanian government is because there is a Jordanian government. There is a king. He rules Jordan. He is in charge of the whole Jordanian military. The Jordanian military is pretty good and relatively professional, right? There is nothing like that in Syria. And the Israelis should be trying to make Syria Jordan, make Syria Jordan, period. Instead, they go, well, we're actually going to try to make Syria less stable, but stability is actually working against their security objectives. But what does this mean for the U.S.? Again, the longer there is instability in the Middle East, the more the U.S. is going to be drawn into it, as we've seen with Israel and Iran, and the less the U.S. is able to focus on what are increasingly important geostrategic considerations, namely a resurgent Russia and a resurgent China. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to James J21, Yanko Georgiev, Chris Gorsuch, Paul Templeton, Cytronic, Steve Rantio, Need, Alan Nuts, and CM Holmes, all of our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do it without you guys. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed the videos on Thursday, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Cheers.